Okay, well, hello everyone, and welcome to this webinar sponsored by ASPA's section on democracy and social justice, serving the public interest and promoting constitutional values, which is part 2 of a 6-part DSJ series on ethics education. This event is being recorded and will be placed later on DSJ's YouTube page and social media. My name is Schein and I serve as chair of the section. I'm going to be remaining largely off camera for the duration of this event, which really just makes the video editing easier. And we're also pleased to be joined today by Adam Bartley and Ellen Schein, who will be assisting us with interpreting for American Sign Language. So for the opening portion and until audience Q&A, I'm just going to ask that everyone except panelists keep their video off, which will improve the quality and the recording. But before getting started, we're going to be sharing a couple links with you in the chat. We would like to let you know of another webinar we have coming up later this month. We in DSJ are hosting a series on dismantling white supremacy in public service organizations and in society. And this next webinar will be held from 1 to 2:30 p.m. Eastern Time on July 23rd. And the RSVP link should be coming through in the chat soon. And the recording for the first 2 episodes in the series are available, and we'll also be sending those to you as well. And further, DSJ is partnering with the journal Administrative Theory and Praxis to offer a dialogue series on this topic. And you should hopefully be getting the call for papers right about now. And we would really like to thank Editor-in-Chief Dr. Stacy Zavataro for supporting this series. And as we face issues of police brutality and killings of Black persons, persons of colors, and Indigenous persons, and as protests against these killings and calls for reform in the criminal justice system escalate, we really, especially through defunding the police or promoting representativeness or changing how bail and parole works, the discussions of the need to promote equity and justice are all the more needed, which is really what we're going to discuss on July 23rd. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. We're really proud to be joined today by 4 amazing panelists. We have Dr. Nicole Elias of John Jay College of Criminal Justice in the CUNY system, Dr. Amanda Olejarski of Westchester University, and also the managing editor of the journal Public Integrity. We have Dr. Mike Potter of Mississippi State University, who's also the editor-in-chief of the journal Public Integrity, and Dr. Brendan Stern from Gallaudet University. And in the first episode of our series on ethics, we spoke with Dr. Agatha Caraballo, Dr. Carol Yevakovich, Dr. James Farr, and Dr. Blue Wooldridge. And we're going to be sending you the links to those recordings, which you can see right now. And we're going to be having more episodes in this series, and you can see them here. So just mark your calendars right now for these dates coming up, because we have a lot of great things coming up. We're going to talk about speaking truth to power, promoting ethical conduct, social equity, diversity, and inclusion as ethical priorities, and the future of public administration ethics. And in this episode, we're really going to be focusing on the first 2 elements of ASPA's codes of ethics, which you can see here: advancing the public interest and upholding the Constitution and the law. And we're going to be sending you a couple links to ASPA's website on these codes, as well as ASPA's publication on implementing the codes. And as you can see from these elements, these are really important, especially considering the current times. We are in what Susan Gooden calls a double pandemic, COVID-19 and racism. And so discussing the meaning of these ethical principles is especially important. What does it mean to advance the public interest? What does it mean to uphold the Constitution and law during this double pandemic? And what must public service organizations, groups, and individuals do to promote fairness, equity, and justice for all? And we're going to be addressing this today. And as we note in our recent DSJ statement on police killings, these inequities and injustices must stop. So what we're going to be doing today, just one more slide on logistics. We are here till 2:30 p.m. Eastern Time, is recorded and posted later. We're going to start with some opening questions we co-developed with the panelists, about 4 of them. Then we're going to open up to audience Q&A. And if you'd like to ask a question, please type it in the chat. If you'd like to be unmuted to ask the question, please also indicate in the chat. So with that, I'm actually going to stop the screen share right now. And 1 second while I get to this. And I'm going to be copy and pasting our first question into the chat, and our panelists just answer in whatever order you feel inspired, interrupt each other and so forth. It'll be great. So let me just get the chat ready. And here we go with the first question. So the first question is this: The first principle of ASPIS, well, actually it would help if I shared it with everyone, wouldn't it? Sorry about that. The first principle of ASPIS Code of Ethics regards the need for public administrators to serve the public interest. In terms of ethical competency, what does this mean and how is it achieved? And anyone feel free to go.
I'm never afraid to chat. I'll give you kind of my thinking. I think one of the most important things that we can do as ethical educators is to make sure that we're relaying the complexity of ethical decision making, and how the banality of evil exists, right? How there are ways that we can, even in a manner that's not completely self-aware, have the best intentions and have some fairly negative consequences about it. So for me, I'm a big proponent of thinking about, reading about cases that are very in depth, and trying to put people in the mindset of people who maybe acting in good faith made bad decisions. I mean, I think those are the cases where the negative consequences are preventable. Whereas if somebody's just acting in bad faith, they're manipulating the system, we can't really, that's a whole different set of problems that we have to deal with. So for me, it is making sure that we are relaying the complexity of these situations and understanding without judgment why these things exist, so that we can address the circumstances that led to these situations. Hope that makes sense.
Yes, thank you. Any of our other panelists, please feel free to jump in at any time.
Hi, Sean. Thank you so much for putting this together. And just to follow up on what Dr. Potter mentioned, I think that this idea of the public interest, or how we as administrators, as scholars of public administration in an applied field, really conceptualize and act upon the common good or the public interest, which are often used interchangeably, is really important. I think that this fundamental starting point is constantly contested. So even if we ask the panelists today, I think we would have a tough time coming up with an agreed upon definition, let alone pointing to specific policies and actions that are without a doubt contributing to the public interest and public good. So I'm so happy that we're able to have this conversation today and get into the weeds, because I think that ultimately this does come back to a democracy, social justice question of public interest or common good for whom, and how can we understand the public or segments of the public from an administrative perspective that really contributes to this larger good in an ethical manner.
Okay, so I want to build on what my colleagues have just said. In practice, it's a very difficult concept to define. The public good. Well, it reminds me of what the Supreme Court said about pornography. We know it when we see it. It's a tricky and difficult conception to get wrapped around, because it is contextually defined. What was seen as public good 50 years ago might not be today. What a public administrator, and 50 years ago, it was seen as in the public interest to know if they were gay, but not if they drove drunk and hit somebody on the way home or beat their wife. So mores changed over time, and it's important to recognize that the public administrators are making judgment calls about the public, what the public good is, and how they may serve it. And it is value dependent. So with that in mind, ethical competence, to me, calls us to look at how we can serve, but also, while doing that, ask the right questions about whether or not we're teaching these competencies to administrators, whether they have a love for ethical thinking, ethical capacities, empathy, self-awareness, emotional and social intelligence, and intellectual humility and curiosity.
A wonderful response. Thank you.
If I could just kind of synthesize what all three of you brilliant scholars have already said before me, it seems to me that a common theme when we talk about the public interest is trying to figure out the context or who the public is that we're serving, or what's the broader socioeconomic context of the situation. And to me, that always reminds me of the public interest being the question mark at the end of every public action that we take. And if we think about the public interest and what that means in all these different contexts, particularly in light of the pandemics that are occurring right now, it seems that the consistent or a consistent way to come up with an interpretation is with the Constitution, and kind of going back to what is the rule of law. Whether we agree or disagree, it's a starting point. It is the law. And so what does the Constitution say? What constitutional powers are granted to the different administrative actors, the legislative actors, and how can we bridge that gap? And so, I look at it thinking from the context of, or from the perspective of the frontline bureaucrats, right, and the boots on the ground, and their role in implementing the Constitution and taking these constitutional principles and putting them into practice using their discretion. And so to kind of round out the discussion, it's how do we educate them? How do we train them to think about these questions critically, while also giving them the latitude to exercise their administrative discretion?
Okay, excellent, excellent. Do any of our panelists have any follow-ups about this before we ask the second question? Okay, all right. Well, I'm going to go ahead and copy and paste the second question in here. So just we have a couple people who are just joined us. So we are going through the first 4 questions we co-developed with the panelists to set the stage. And then if you would like to ask a question during Q&A, that's absolutely fine. Just indicate so in the chat. And we would also ask that for everyone except panelists to keep their videos off for now, which will improve the AV quality and recording. Also, if you are interested in American Sign Language interpreting, please look at video screen for interpreter equals Ellen Schein, who's doing an amazing job right now, and also Adam Bartley. So with that, without further ado, here is the second question. In what ways does the US Constitution and state constitutions inform what it means to be an ethically competent public administrator and inform ethics in PA in general? And just answer in any order you want.
If I could hop on and just sort of elaborate on my last point, it seems that if we are looking to the Constitution, right, if we're looking and saying that the ASL Code of Ethics, the second component, is to uphold the Constitution and the law, what ethical principles can we then derive from the federal Constitution and the related state constitutions, and how can we use those principles to put into practice, training our public administrators to focus on the public good, the public interest. And so I think it all connects back in the contextualization of the ethical principles, what's going on in the time, what was, as I think one of my colleagues said a moment ago, what may have been acceptable and serving the public good at one time, now we look upon it and it's shameful, part of our past. And so how can we use those lessons from our past to teach our students to inform the future?
That's a great response. And just so everyone is clear, I just posted the 2 first principles of ASPA's codes of ethics in the chat, just so everyone can see. But the full link is also above in the chat. So thank you, Dr. Olejarski, for getting us started.
So if I could jump in here, I think the best way to think about the Constitution is not necessarily a prescriptive guide that tells us exactly what to do or how to do it. But if we could think about it more broadly as a framework, as a starting point. So one metaphor that Dr. Olejarski and I really like to use is the Constitution as a compass or a roadmap. It tells you generally where to go, but it doesn't give you as much specificity as a GPS would. It's not going to give you specific direction. Now, scholars, both of us, especially in our recent projects together, have really struggled with this because we want the answers and we want certainty. But at the same time, the beauty of the Constitution is that it has this ambiguity. It has this flexibility for the future. Often, and those of you who teach any sort of normative foundations or ethics courses probably have these really tough conversations with students where they're frustrated by this. They want the answers. And, what we can look to for more certainty and how to implement and how to make sense of these ethically gray areas that the Constitution does provide is we can look to subsequent interpretations by courts, and we could look to public policy that fits within that larger framework. And that takes us one step further. But then again, the big caveat is policy is vague too, right? You can hear your students saying this, yes, professor, but that only gets us so far. So what do I do in this certain context or when I'm crafting policy in my specific agency? And that's where the art of public administration really comes into play. That's where things come to life, and we as practitioners, we as scholars get to be creative in our guidance, in our policy making, and in our administrative decision making. So we can start, it's almost like a funnel. You start with the Constitution, and you can tease out these very broad principles, these ethical foundations that exist in the penumbras of the Constitution. And then you get to public policy, or you get to court cases, which tell you how this can be interpreted on a more specific level. And then finally, you get to the actual doing, which is where our conversation started today. And that's the real challenge of ethics in an applied field like PA. We can't come up with the nice, neat packaged answers for every context, but we can drill it down to provide more guidance within different general scenarios. So it's both frustrating and really exciting, I would say, because this also creates a scenario where you can look to certain administrators or certain policies or agencies as highlights, as key examples of when it's done right. And like, many of us have said up to this point, it when you see it. And so finding those shining examples of ethics done right is really awesome, because then we can build on that. We can continue to grow from there, and we can continue to apply those lessons learned from real world examples in the future.
Excellent, thank you.
If I could, I'd like to kind of tailgate on what Nicole was saying. I think there are a lot of challenges that administrators deal with nowadays that are incredibly complex. And I think that the Constitution, the U.S. Constitution, certainly its value in governance to me is that it protects administrators who are acting in good faith with a long-term orientation to try to solve problems and move society forward. I think if it's if it's divorced from that context, it becomes a real challenge for me because of all of the flaws we know of the founding era. I also, in the last 8 or 10 years, have become a little bit more suspicious of the politicization of courts and how they function. And I don't have the faith now I had 5 years ago in their interpretations of regime values. I do, however, have a lot of faith in street level bureaucrats. And even if it doesn't discreetly forbid action, but enables them to engage, and there is enough deference. I mean, there's considerable deference for people who are acting on behalf of government, as long as it's not a hurdle and people can engage in the action and solve the problems and be able to defend themselves and have the cover to do it. I'm much more comfortable with it. I think the U.S. Constitution, and I'm sitting here in Starkville, Mississippi, is certainly a vastly different animal from some state constitutions. We have a constitution of 1890. It was ratified in 1890 in Mississippi. You can imagine what that constitution looks like for people of color. It has lots of horrible poll tax, Jim Crow era stuff that's horrible for everyone. But one of the things that you see is that administrators are able to kind of avoid that and sometimes can make a little bit better the situation than obviously if you carried out that constitution the way the framers intended it. So I think that's also sort of my faith in the ability of people who know the problems. And also, I mean, this is where it ties together with me, have the self-awareness to understand that they have the ability to shape these problems, and they have indeed a responsibility to be aware of the legal context, to be aware of the complexity, and make those decisions in good faith, and to be able, one of the panelists mentioned it, but have the humility to set aside their own ego. I think that's one thing that public servants do a great job of. And try to get to how you can improve that situation, even if the rest of the context is tremendously challenging. And there are always going to be times when that doesn't work out the way that I just stated it. But I think more often than not, it's something that does happen with a lot of public servants.
Excellent, thank you.
At the risk of looking politically incorrect, I do believe there is a great deal of wisdom to be found and a great deal of human nature to be found in the Constitution. In the Federalist number 51, Madison writes, "But what is government itself but the greatest of all reflections on human nature? If men were angels, there would be no need for government. Government would be unnecessary." So I think we can be informed by the Constitution in both its inherent checks and balances and representation. Checks and balances ensure that nobody and no group becomes too powerful. Now, also in its values of representation, and being able to speak in behalf of another group is at the core of representative government. But one of the challenges of our government is how we can express the feelings of a people and of a diverse people at large when we have 535 representatives in Congress and a country of 328 million Americans. And those 535 people live in a bubble in Washington when the rest of us are living in the real world, You're sitting there in Mississippi. So, how do we impress upon the public administrators the need to be responsive to those communities? And as our country grows increasingly diverse, we have to think about through how representative bureaucracy, how through that we can make sure that government also looks like us, looks like the public. How can public administrators, how can people in the public see public administrators and see themselves in that role too? So all of this is to say that ethical competence is critical to public administration, because if we want to be successful in governing, we have to have a great love for the checks and balances present in our system. And we also have to continue to increase greater representation within the bureaucracy so that it represents the diversity that's inherent in society.
Great answer, Dr. Stern. Do any of our panelists want to follow up?
I will, just because Amanda and I kind of smirked at each other when you mentioned Federalist 51. John Rory used to talk about that in his seminar classes and say, you know, even if man were angels, they still need government. And he said, what do angels do? They sing. And if they're a choir, someone has to coordinate them and direct them. So whenever I hear Federalist 51, it makes me think of that lesson that he said. Yet it's more complex even than just not thinking about human nature, right? There's still coordinating that is really important and has some tremendous ethical aspects of it. That's the only thing I wanted, just brought me back to a seminar in probably 2009.
Dr. Stern, would you like to respond?
No, I think that was well framed. I like how you framed it.
Okay, excellent. That was a good comment. So let's just get to our third question. It's actually a perfect segue into what we're going to be talking about next. And I'm going to be posting the question in the chat. It's like regular. So here we go. So given what Dr. Susan Gooden has termed the double pandemic, COVID-19 and racism, how do you see regime values and constitutional laws, for instance, positively and maybe even negatively informing our understanding of the causes and solutions to these issues?
I have some thoughts I'm happy to share. It absolutely, before we got into the forum, we were talking about what COVID looks like here in Mississippi. And there's no greater or sadder example of how systemic racism is, especially in the rural areas down here where the rates of COVID deaths are far disproportionately affecting African Americans. So it is a kind of a double whammy. I think the optimism is that COVID will be gone, and hopefully at most 8 months or a year, we'll figure it out. And we've had racism in this country for 401 years, I believe, at this point. So it's going to take us a really long time to even kind of admit the depth of the problem. And who knows what that entails in just trying to mitigate the effects of it. I mean, it's been amazing the past few months to see what's happened in social justice with BLM and the horrible killing of George Floyd. And there's been more progress in the last couple of months than there has been in a really long time. I mean, it's been moving quickly, but we still have so far to go. And I think to the credit of people I talk with in public administration, social justice is at the forefront of how we think about instruction. And if it's not, our students will make sure it is, because this is what they're really passionate about. I would say most of my students who come into the MPPA here are social justice focused, like as their main concern. So, you know, I think it takes a lot of effort, because you have to get past the simplistic notion of the founders were white men, many of them slave owners, and they punted on abolishing slavery. Jefferson's quote, right? It's like a wolf by the ears. You don't like it, but you dare not let it go. And that was a great disgrace. And then society thinks it's solved with the Civil War, and then Reconstruction kind of falls apart. I mean, there's so much history there, but you have to understand and have to be able to communicate to students that there still are some really positive aspects of the founding, these Enlightenment values that we keep talking about. this idea that people have the ability to rise by the merit of their actions, or even be treated somewhat equally as we have become more democratic and understood in greater detail what that means to extend those rights to more people, indeed everybody who should receive them. So I think that's one of the big challenges for us, is when you have a short-term crisis like COVID-19, it becomes a great drain. It becomes a great challenge and exacerbates some of these longer issues that we haven't dealt with. But it also can be kind of an opportunity. I mean, it's horrible, but it can also be an opportunity to bring some of these challenges. So,
okay, so that makes me think of, what was it, just yesterday? No, it was on Sunday. I was teaching civics. I was teaching that to my 7-year-old daughter. And so I was telling her, think about a campaign idea, how to run a campaign for president, right? What would your campaign speech be? And so she responded to me something that I can't stop thinking about. She said, you should vote for me because I will work and advance social justice. I will stop racism by putting all the racists in prison and make them apologize. And, you know, it just struck me because I'm going to have a lot more classes with her. But it's just like Dr. Potter was saying. You know, I think social justice is on everyone's mind. And I think most of it we can all agree on. It's the how of it, how to achieve it, that's so difficult. So how can we resolve these issues? It might be disheartening, but I read an article in the Washington Post. So they were doing a study of residents across America and seeing how diverse they are, which are becoming more diverse and so forth. So as civil rights legislation has passed, we see that residential neighborhoods remain as segregated, nearly as segregated as they ever have been. Now, with the pandemic, in a time where government response, correcting the interpretation, thank you for your patience. So when governors have given orders about social distancing and masking, some people have been cooperative with that and some have not. And so I would say that if we look at constitutional law and the need to also recognize the legalistic nature of it.
Legislation.
You know, it's the legislation, correction, the need for legislation as well, but you cannot legislate all behaviors. And so it can be much more important to focus on culture than legislation at times. And so I think that has been a concern of our founding fathers and the virtues of citizenship. And so I think it's very important to recognize both the causes and potential solutions of COVID-19, of racism, and so forth. The resolution of all of these will require cooperation of people to create change, to create changes in the way people think or feel, you know, and to create changes in law or all of that. Whatever it is, it can be helped, and that's how.
So I think that, you know, one of the biggest takeaways that I gained from, I mean, so many, the last DSJ webinar on racism was so impactful. And a big takeaway from that session was, you know, why now? why pay attention to racism now? And in some ways, I think that the silver lining of COVID, stopping our lives, stopping the distractions of sports or entertainment and just, the hustle and bustle generally, has caused us to really hone in on these issues that impact individuals and populations differently within the United States. So would George Floyd be on our minds today if, baseball had resumed and, we were just kind of going along as life as we knew it pre-COVID? And so in some ways, I think that COVID has prompted us to recognize things that maybe would not have been as impactful to the general consciousness of the entire public. And I also think that, to Dr. Stern's earlier point, this is where the Constitution really falls short of, instituting change. And I think who is in power really does matter, and what those people look like and their life experiences really do matter. And so having representatives who have experienced racism in their lives, who have experienced disparities that, that what I think he termed the Washington bubble has not necessarily felt firsthand, is really important. So as much as we'd like to look to the Constitution and as much as we'd like to rely on the Civil Rights Act to address these issues, it's the doing, it's the people, and it's the push to institute change. And another aspect of COVID, or I should say consequence of COVID, that has really been felt along racial and ethnic lines, and especially gender lines, is the childcare piece. So I just wanted to bring that in to the conversation as well, because not having affordable childcare and who is deemed an essential worker or not in light of this pandemic has really raised some major red flags when we think about the paid economy, when we think about systemic racism, and when we think about these disparities and how we can use this as a focusing event to really institute long-lasting change to address some of those issues that, as we've all said, have been around for, quite some time.
Excellent, thank you.
That was a great point about childcare too, and just specifically, bringing that to the forefront again. Oh, I see Brendan. Sorry, go ahead. Go ahead.
No, please. So what Nicole was saying is something I can be completely on board with. I have to impress upon us that policy changes can help, but policy is a necessary thing. However, it's not sufficient in and of itself.
A fantastic qualification.
And that leads right into the next sort of where I was going to go to. So thank you, Dr. Stern. That was a perfect segue. Thinking about sort of holistically the context of these webinars on educating people on ethics in the Constitution and regime values and constitutional law, and so how can it inform? One of the things that we have been struggling with in Pennsylvania in the COVID environment is our governor has been a very strong proponent of putting forth his health and his health secretary, Dr. Rachel Levine. And so one of the things that's been absolutely fascinating to me is that in 2020, we're still having this idea of a legitimacy conversation, right? And so because in Pennsylvania, the governor has been putting forth a lot of his rules and regulations via the health secretary. And so that she's been mandating, that masks are required in public, masks are, required social distancing. There's been a large portion of the population in Pennsylvania that's saying that those are actually not laws because Secretary Levine is not an elected official. And to me, you know, that I'm reminded of Dr. Stern, you know, talking with his daughter, right, at 7 years old, and thinking about, no, you know, we've got to do more to correct these just at the foundational level. And how can we do more to get at these deeper questions when we can't even have a fundamental agreement about what constitutes a law in 2020 in the United States of America? And it's, on one hand, the optimist in me thinks, you know, this is a great opportunity to educate. But then the other part of me gets really frustrated because, you know, this is not everybody's area of expertise. Everybody's not as interested in the Constitution as perhaps those of us who are in attendance. And so it makes good rhetoric to say, look, it's not a law. It wasn't passed by the governor. It wasn't passed by the legislature. And so how can we do more to try to educate people earlier in the process so that we can really spend more time talking about these bigger, more important issues that my colleagues here have brought up today?
Fantastic. Do any of our panelists have any follow-ups?
I'd like just one of the things that that Nicole said had me thinking about it too. And I think one of the issues that COVID-19, in addition to racism, has brought out about sort of our public laws, for me, is how important class privilege is in our society. And I hadn't really thought about it. I mean, I knew it was there. We all know that it matters a lot, but you really see it with these essential workers and some of these people. And there's very little in the Constitution, even though the Constitution was responding directly to this massive class bias that came from Great Britain, that kind of addresses the idea of class. Some of the anti-federalists, I think it was Sentinel, it's been a while, were arguing for having representation be class-based, right? You would have sort of like the estates in France. You'd have one house that would be the drovers, and another house that would be merchants. And so there were concerns, but I think by function of how elite the founders were, they didn't seem to come through in the Constitution. And I think that's something that also impacts social justice, because race and class, they do tend to go hand in hand, and they tend to be a big challenge. And as we grapple with race, we really don't talk that much about class anymore. I mean, at least we don't in Mississippi generally at all, right? I think in some places you'll hear a discussion of class with the minimum wage, mandatory minimum wage, and some of those aspects. But it'd be really hard to uplift Black people, African Americans in our country, without dealing with issues of class at the same time. Just wanted to make that.
Excellent. Anyone else have any follow-up comments? Okay. Let me go ahead and post the fourth question, and then we will open it up to audience Q&A. I actually already received a few questions over the chat, so it'll be a fun discussion. So here is the fourth prepared question that we have. I'm going to send it through the chat. What pedagogical suggestions do you have to promote ethical competency, especially concerning the roles of constitutional law, but it can be other types of law, anything related to the first two principles of ASPIS codes of ethics or other principles?
So in terms of teaching ethics, I would say the most effective tool that I've really utilized, even when not teaching a class solely on ethics, but really getting at the ethical implications of topics within any class, especially HR classes. I really love to use case studies, and case studies are great for a number of reasons, but I think the biggest benefit that I've heard from students has been that they are able to put themselves in different roles, different mindsets, and really think about all of the values that underlie their decision-making and their simulations within the context of a case study exercise. And just as a plug to a case study that I worked on with you, Dr. McCandless, there's a great section in JPay that has a number of really rich case studies that I've used in several of my courses. But, in terms of the discussion we've had today, the case study that we did together really focuses on Confederate statue removal. And this has been really popular with a lot of my students, and it's been well received in my courses. So this is one approach that I think is really effective when getting at ethical issues and values that sometimes are very difficult to talk about in courses on an individual level. So talking about those values, preferences, beliefs from the perspective of someone that you're taking a role on within a simulation context is very effective.
Well, I first of all say I second what Dr. Elias said. The use of case study, because context is king. We've got a bad habit as professors very often in teaching ethics of starting with theory. And, instead of starting from the bottom up and asking, like, what are the questions that we should be asking in this case of our students? So I also wanted to respond to the question itself. The question asks us about ethical competencies. And very often, that makes me uncomfortable for a couple of reasons. The first that I want to share is that there was a fascinating study that looked at ethical behaviors of different groups of people and found that unethical persons were very often people who taught ethics. So I think at the risk of, when we talk about teaching ethical competencies, I think we often are at risk of missing our own ethical biases and our implicit biases. So if we look at the increasing polarization of Americans, another study asked people how they would rate their own morals. And 90% of Americans said they had good morals. I've got great morals. But when they were asked a follow-up question of how you would rate the country's morals and those values, almost 90% of Americans said that American moral values were on the decline. So the moral of this story is that there is a psychological priming effect that we have to think about right and wrong differently than others do. So in terms of resolving this in our pedagogy, of addressing that with our students, how we teach our students to get back to that, to counteract that psychological priming effect. But one is case studies, as you mentioned, also teaching intellectual humility, the moral value of that. And so we should tell our students that we are not here to seek answers, we're here to ask the right questions. Our work as professors is not to steer our students in the right direction towards truth, but rather to encourage them all to understand how to ask the right questions for themselves, to question their own mindsets, to question the context of their own questions, to examine the choices that they have and how those line up against their own values.
Excellent. Yeah, we'll have some more context about that later, but appreciate the response.
I mean, Dr. Stern just kind of very eloquently stated what I was going to say, almost to the T, that the idea that we can't engage in moralizing when we teach ethics, that we've got to make sure we convey the complexity. The students are going to draw their own conclusions. Sometimes they're not the conclusions we would draw. But letting them understand that these aren't easy decisions, that they're not black and white decisions. And part of that is what Dr. Stern was saying, having the intellectual humility, being self-aware, and teaching our students to be self-aware. I think that's really important too. understanding the biases that you bring into decision and doing what you can to check those biases with other information. And once again, I think that jives right with Dr. Stern's point. You got to seek disconfirming information. That's something that people don't naturally like to do. And if you believe that moralizing, the moralizing of ethical decisions, that leads you to this idea that, well, it's simple, it's black and white, and then you end up in that confirmation bias problem that that I think is such a challenge for some of our students. So yeah, I think he said it much better than I can, but I wholeheartedly agree with him.
Thank you.
I also agree, and I just was going to sort of round it out by offering just one of the assignments that I use as an example, because I like to combine sort of what everyone is recommending, right? To do a case study, to point to some of the theories, how it might actually manifest in practice. But I like to then have students specifically on the syllabus say to them, pretend you are this administrator, pretend I'm giving you X number of resources, pretend you're at this organization, and put yourself in the position of the decision maker. And what does that then look like? What do your policy recommendations look like? Are they feasible? Are they politically feasible? Are they fiscally responsible? And being open to, as long as they can support their arguments and support their policy ramifications, right? That you, as everyone has said, you are intellectually human. I cannot say the word, but you know what I'm saying, humble, humility. And I think that that's so key, right, for us as professors, because we oftentimes are trained to think there's one best way to do something. And so being able to embrace that in our students and say to them, I may disagree with you fundamentally, however, that doesn't make you incorrect. It is very difficult. It's very challenging. And I think that's something that comes with practice and comes with teaching graduate students because they're far more apt to challenge us, which is nice, right? I think it's scary in the beginning when we get started teaching, but as we progress, I know I personally enjoy those moments in the classroom.
So, Dr. Stern saying, I want to add to what was said. You pretty much said it all. Our students are there to challenge us as teachers, and it can be very difficult to do that. It takes examination of self. I am a white male. I'm a straight white male, and I may be having a student for whom that produces some anxieties. There's power differentials that are present in those identities. And there was one thing I read and have seen in our classes that, it's very important to say that to our students, I will not lie to you. I want to make that explicit to my students the first week of class. I want to establish a culture in the classroom that we're open to challenge, that we're open to being questioned, that we're open to skepticism. And I put that front and center in the very outset of the semester.
Fantastic discussion. We actually have a couple questions we've already received. So again, I'm just going to repost this message in the chat. A question comes from Dr. Seth Meyer. So 1 second, Seth. I will activate that right now. So Seth, you should be off mute, and you should be also able to share your video as well.
Sure. Can you see me?
Yes.
Perfect. Hi, everyone. Thank you for an excellent discussion. I want to go back a little bit on something Dr. Stern talked about a little bit earlier. And this is something especially connected to some of the work that you do, Dr. Elias, where we're talking about social justice and public interest, but people have very different viewpoints on what public interest is. My work is on LGBTQ issues, and I deal with people who think both that the public interest on one hand is to provide support for LGBTQ people. On the other hand, some people feel that the public interest is to provide conversion therapy to LGBTQ people. We can move beyond that. In the deaf community, there's been, if you look at deaf schools and how that's played out, there's always been a question about public interest. So when we're teaching ethics and when we're doing research, when we're doing these discussions, how do we deal with these conflicts on what is public interest?
One of the ways that I try to address the complexity of that is to talk about identity and what it really means. So for me, as a deaf person who teaches at Gallaudet University, the only university of its like in the world that is for deaf and hard of hearing students, at first glance, that might look as though we all share the same values and beliefs as deaf people. But it's obvious that's not true. One of the ways that I try to move beyond that is to provide a contrasting view.
Contrarian.
A contrarian view from thinkers who think differently about that, so that we can see that we don't have the same sense and values about our experiences in deaf institutions. And so we have to look at somebody who might come into Gallaudet with a cochlear implant, for example, and they may have a belief that being able to speak English and hear spoken English to whatever extent makes them somehow better than other deaf people. So those experiences are very challenging for our students to move beyond. That our experiences as deaf people are varied, and that these labels are really labels are just for cans. That's really, there's no other purpose for labels. People are people. And if we want to get people from an identity group who are not, having their voices shared, we have to look at those issues. I think that's one of the things that I try to do about that.
Wonderful, wonderful response. Dr. Elias, I think, did you want to go next?
Sure. Thanks, Sean. And thanks, Seth. That's a great question. And, it's a very interesting question, especially in light of the recent Supreme Court decision, thinking about LGBTQ+ rights. In 2014, I was working with the EEOC's OFO, Office of Federal Operations work group on LGBT, at the time it was LGBT issues. And this idea of objectors, objectors to the progression of inclusion of the LGBTQ+ community, was a significant challenge within the EEOC, as well as beyond in other workplaces, other public administrators who were serving the public. And when an individual belief set conflicts with, say, a policy, we all remember, the refusal to grant marriage license to gay and lesbian couples in Kentucky, or refusing to bake a wedding cake if it were a gay or lesbian couple. So we have these stories, but there's also another level of microaggressions and things that take place within the workplace that are very unfortunate. But to answer your question, Seth, this issue has been on my mind for years, but to answer your specific question of how do we get at the public interest, and how do we understand the public interest in the context of the way that issues evolve today, I would say that we have to look at the package as a whole. So we look at the Constitution, we look at the policies we have in place, we look at court rulings, we look at agency policy. And, thinking about those outliers, those objectors that do not want to, based on personal beliefs, have an equitable approach to public administration and policy, that doesn't, I would say, throw a wrench in this idea of there is a public interest to treat individuals and groups equitably. And I think that goes back to Dr. Stern's last point. When we think about what's the fundamental basis for the way that individuals and groups are segmented and treated, we could say that all individuals are the same, but because of physical, mental markers, they're categorized in different ways. But that shouldn't impede our ability as administrators or scholars to work within those bounds and create equitable solutions for each particular group or individual.
Thank you.
I'd like to make a comment along those same lines too. I think Charles Goodsell wrote that public interest is most easily identified by what it's not, right? And that is that it's not short-term, it's not for political advantage. And you kind of think, for me, I kind of think in terms of how do you do things that are in the long-term interest of people, right? Like and I think that helps with a little bit of that, the challenge of understanding the concept. And what is not in the long-term interest of people is to not be too many knots, but to not be an inclusive manager. If you're othering or dividing people, clearly that's not in the long-term interest. So trying to make sure that everyone, as broadly as possible, is included and served in equitable ways, and encouraging that, I think is, for me, based on that definition, meets it pretty close.
Thank you.
I just have one final point to kind of sum up what my colleagues have said. And it seems to me that the important take home here about this issue is that there is a concerted interest in following the public interest or in pursuing the public interest. And I think that it's important that we as academics, as professors, that we make sure that we are conveying that to our students, right? It's very easy for us to point out the flaws with the system and the many challenges, but I think it's refreshing, particularly with this new generation of college-age students. I am optimistic that we're going to see a lot more progress in the coming years. And so I want to make sure that we do focus on that and we don't take the wind out of their sails.
Good point. Any panelists have any comments they'd like to raise, clarifications or other questions? We have one other question coming up, but I just want to make sure. Okay. All right. So our next question is going to be from Latoya Noble. So Latoya, 1 second. Let me just find you in the list here. So, okay, Latoya, you should be off mute.
All right, thank you so much. Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for all of your great insight. And I'm so sorry I have my children in the back, just in case. But I find that I'm actually going to be an incoming student into Westchester University's MPA program, and I sometimes feel disheartened in the fact that I have lived the disparities and still live the disparities and inequality that Dr. Stern spoke of. So how as professors how do you advise future public administrators, to make change or do their jobs efficiently while also, of course, maintaining the separation of ego under administrations that do not speak in line with what we may agree or what, for the most part, is not an agreed upon ethical stance, like holistically, and unfortunately, which can be deemed as prominent in this administration we are in now?
Fantastic question. Who'd like to go first?
I think the richness.
Dr. Potter, you went on mute.
Oh, I thought Dr. Stern wanted to make a comment.
Go right ahead.
I was just going to say, I think that the richness of the experience of people who come into public administration is its saving grace, right? We all have different experiences. And I think the challenge is to make sure that we're not alienating or pre-selecting somehow people who all come from the same background. It's particularly important nowadays that we are making sure that students from very diverse backgrounds feel comfortable because that's how like we've been saying this whole session, that's how our democracy works, is by administrators who come from a variety of backgrounds and have insight into problems that Dr. Stern mentioned it too. I'm a white male, cisgender. It's hard for me to understand a lot of issues, but what I can do is have someone come into the classroom and make them feel welcome, make them feel comfortable, and make them aware of me as an ally and someone who can try to understand and let them speak their mind. Because the great fun for me of being a professor is learning from the students. That's not I don't say that, as a canned response. That is the truth. Like, you get paid to bring these wonderful people into your classroom who have these varieties of experiences, and you get to hear about it and understand them and see how great they are. And when they make decisions, they're going to make decisions differently from me. But they need to make decisions differently from me because they have had different experiences and they see the world differently. And I think that's the great value for me. So and by the way, you're going to love Dr. Olejarski when you get into that program. She's wonderful, as you can tell from this session. So you've got great faculty there. All I can listen.
Yeah. Dr. Olejarski is pretty amazing.
I echo that. I think for future administrators or current administrators, in order to navigate that environment, I think it's really critical that you be creative and you have a bit of optimism, as Dr. Olejarski was talking about us as professors. I think the administrators need to be optimistic as well. So, as cliche as it may sound, I think that it's the administrators who see challenges as opportunities that are most effective. And so I remember, since we're talking about the glory days at CPAP and Virginia Tech, I remember in one of my org theory classes, I don't think Dr. Olejarski or Potter were in this class, but we looked at a case study where an administrator was working at a library, and there was an influx of after-school shenanigans going on. So, how do we deal with all of these students who are, hanging around the parking lot, and, there's all sorts of business going on with these students congregating at the library. Well, instead of seeing it as a problem, this administrator was able to see it as an opportunity and created programming to bring those students into the library, to engage them and to provide the public service that the library is intended to provide. But it took a little bit of extra work, thinking outside of the box, and that creative optimism in order to make that happen. It wasn't just, calling the police and ushering them out of the parking lot every afternoon. So I think that example really captures where you can make a difference. So working within the parameters of your position, but also really trying to think outside the box a bit.
Dr. Olejarski, Dr. Stern?
I think just to kind of echo Dr. Elias and Dr. Potter's points, it really does come down to the administrative discretion and making sure that we are we're educating our students in ways that they know that they are empowered and that they can speak truth to power, and that if they have personal values that differ from the professional values, to learn how they can work within the confines of the system for that public interest, so that even if the system is flawed, as we, I think, can mostly acknowledge that it is in a lot of different examples, how can we then help empower our students and inspire them to, not just empower, but to inspire them to want to do good time after time after time.
Fantastic.
Okay, so first of all, I want to congratulate Latoya for your entrance into that program. It looks like you're in really good hands. And that first step in making, positive change is doing just what you're doing. So I want to make sure I've got your question. So please stop me if I've misunderstood your question at all. But I think it starts with having a mindset, having the right mindset. The idea of resilience is so important, starting off by recognizing that life is very difficult. Life is a hard thing, and change is even harder. So I tell my students that if they want to change the world, fine. The first thing they have to think about is how hard is it to change your own behavior. Take one of your own daily behaviors. So my wife, for example, my wife cannot stand the way she wants me to wash dishes, right? So it is so hard for me to wash dishes her way. So it takes a great deal of effort on my part to change a simple act like washing a dish. So if it's so hard to change an act like washing a dish in the morning, think then about how difficult it is to change the world around us at large. We have to recognize that difficulty first of all, but then after that, in a former life of my own, I'm a teacher, but I have also been a basketball coach, correction, to the interpretation. And so a similar point to that of Dr. Elias, I'll say that, I tell people that you have to keep your eyes on the prize, because in every difficulty, there is opportunity. So, as an example, when our players are running, I have them run sprints. And I'll tell you what, it'll be hell. It'll be hell. But if you think about how tired you are doing that, it's going to be hard to finish the drill if you're thinking only about how hellish it is. But when the players see that drilling, that sprinting as an opportunity to be in good physical condition, to have, a great lung capacity, to get through the game, to have that, those drills, that difficulty makes it easier in the long run. So that's my word of advice about how to persevere through the program and generally through life.
Okay, that is wonderful, wonderful response here. So we did get a question earlier from someone who had to leave, so I will just go ahead and put the question here in the chat. So I'll just ask it for this person, and then we have one other question after this. So this person asked this: do we need stronger laws, maybe even constitutional amendments that better ensure fairness? For instance, constitutional rights are referred to as personally oriented rights that leave out the extent to how collective inequities are. We talk so much about understanding what administrators are empowered by the law to do, but isn't the law sometimes the very problem?
I'll jump in. Absolutely. I think the great drawback of our Constitution in this country is that it's so difficult to change it, to amend it, to really create new rights that have long-standing effect. So yeah, I think it is. I think that the ASPA code doesn't just say be constitutional administrators, but it also says that you need to advocate, advocate for equitable laws. So yeah, it is. It's absolutely. We think about rights, and we're an individualistic society. No greater example is, once again, COVID-19, right? We think about it individualistically, and in societies that are more communitarian, they are not having the issues with people not wanting to wear masks, and thus the outbreak has slowed down in some of those places. But that's the legal situation that we're in. They didn't think about rights in the way that we do now when we were founded, but I still think there's opportunity to make change. And the upside is, when you do get change made, it will be long lasting, right? I mean, it's hard to meet that bar. And by far, back to what Nicole was saying, too many people have vetoes in our system on how things change. It's much easier to play defense in our legal system. But when you do get change, it's very impactful, and it will stay for a long time.
Nice response.
I think that's a really neat question. I don't think we'll ever be able to go to a group-based system of law just based on the legal process in the US. But I do think where we could institute change is the way we attach values, we attach our social understandings and all that comes with that to different group identities. And so I think that's where the shift needs to happen, the way that these groups are constructed, and then how public policy, public administration responds to those constructions.
Good point. Dr. Olejarski, Dr. Stern? Let's go with Dr. Stern.
I would just say I agree with what's been said.
Okay.
Me too.
I'm sorry?
I said me too, ditto.
Okay. I hear you. So Dr. Olejarski, you had one comment from you, but we would like to ask Parisa Vinzant, who is our digital engagement coordinator. She has sort of a question to wrap all this up, and then we'll talk a little bit about a project that Dr. Olejarski is working on that I think everyone here will be interested in. So Parisa, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Sean, and thank you to our fabulous panelists and our very energetic audience. So I guess what I would just want to emphasize, and I would love to get your the panelists' thoughts on, which is, it's regarding our ASPA Code of Ethics. And on one hand, to uphold Constitution, as it says to uphold the Constitution and the law, and yet at the same time, there is a subsection that says that public administrators are required to improve and eliminate laws and or policies that are unethical, counterproductive, or obsolete. And if we take this tenet, which is number 2 of our ASPA Code of Ethics in the strategies section, and we also, take the lens of strengthening social equity and the specific tenet of our ASPA Code of Ethics that says public administrators are to oppose all forms of discrimination and harassment, and to promote affirmative action. cultural competence, and other efforts to reduce disparities in outcomes and to increase the inclusion of underrepresented groups. If we take these two tenets together, does it not strongly imply a action-oriented view of being a public administrator, and is that not something that our field is in the process of perhaps adjusting to, this new a viewpoint of what it means to be an ethical, equitable public administrator? I would love to have your thoughts on that, or whoever this question resonates most with. Thank you so much.
That's a great question, Parisa, and I think I got the essence of it in the chat there. Let's. It would be okay to start with Dr. Stern. Just 1 second. Let me pin the video.
Yep. Okay, so as I'm reading through the question, I think it's a great question, and yes, of course, we're still engaging in change. It is a process that's ongoing and unending. So I think action could be understood in many different ways. So how can we act? What is it that we can do to act? So in our culture and in social media, we see action very often in simple terms. That asks us to identify specific areas where we can act, where we can create change. So if we want to be equitable, I think that is really comes back to the remarks that I opened with today. The importance of humility. If we want to act effectively and competently, we must do so with a sense of intellectual curiosity and a sense of intellectual humility in order to navigate the world so that it becomes a more equitable place for everyone.
That's an excellent response. Our other panelists, what are you curious for your thoughts? Did the question stun you?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And I think especially at the federal level, since the Trump administration, we hear of a lot of this tension going on between, the struggle for, fulfilling the mission of the agency and, enacting kind of the top-down approach to administration that we're so used to, but at the same time, we've got administrators who are using their discretion or really struggling to use their discretion in a way that they see is much more ethical. So I think we've seen a lot of this kind of exit voice loyalty approach in exercising an ethic within the federal level in recent years. And I think it's really become a lot more creative and individualistic than it has in the past. And I'd say, that has this undertone of achieving equitable outcomes that motivate those types of behaviors. When we hear about those individual stories from administrators who have either exited or voiced their dissent. And, we don't hear from those that are loyal as much, but I think it is a new day for administrators. And I think we're still trying to reconcile maintaining bureaucracy, following the rules, following the chain of command, but at the same time, going to sleep at night and being able to really live with yourself as an ethical administrator who in many cases really impacts public health, public safety, and the lives of those that you're serving. So the consequences are high, and I think we're feeling that now as a field and as on an individual level. So I think that's a great question that really points to this moment in time that is so heightened when it comes to ethical questions.
Great point.
Any other comments?
Okay, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to add on to what Nicole said. I think what we're seeing, when people ask about the current state of public administration, I always say, well, there are a lot of teaching moments. And it's an opportunity for us to explain that, everybody in the executive branch doesn't work for the president, and that inspector generals are supposed to be independent and do this criticism. My great fear is along the same lines of what Nicole was saying, is that it's not Hirschman's exit voice loyalty, it's exit loyalty. And that the dissenters are leaving because there are too many problems with dissenting. And when you get into a rural area like Mississippi, they're not even leaving because there aren't other jobs. So it's loyalty. And I think those are some of the big challenges that we deal with now. How do we make people realize that there is a role for dissenters, and in fact, that's how the federal government is structured, that independence.
Mm-hmm. Good point.
My final point very, very quickly would be to ensure that we are not falling victim to the idea of false consciousness, right? That we are making sure that, as we've said earlier repeatedly, right, that we are training our administrators or future generations to be empowered, to be inspired, to know that they have this administrative discretion and how they can be creative in solving today's public problems in the confines provided through the federal constitution or state constitutions and so on and so forth.
And Dr. Olejarski, we're just before we wrap up the event, and I have some closing comments. You have a book to talk about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks, Sean. Dr. Elias and I have been working on A Labor of Love, and it's our book. Thank you. It just went out. It's Ethics for Contemporary Bureaucrats, which Dr. Potter is also a contributing author. And so, shameless plug, if you're teaching ethics, we would strongly recommend that you use this book. It's really neat. We look at regime values and constitutionalism, but it's a very case-based applied focus, and we're specifically gearing it for being used in grad classes. And it was a lot of fun to write. It was a lot of fun to edit. Nicole, do you want to add anything?
I think that was a great summary, but it gets at some of the racial, sex, and gender, hot topics that we've covered today. So, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Well, everyone, thank you so much. We're actually slightly over time, but this is the fun of talking about ethics and the Constitution and so forth. I just want to thank everyone on behalf of DSJ for an amazing conversation. Thank you for attending. Thank you to our amazing panelists, Dr. Elias, Dr. Olejarski, Dr. Potter, Dr. Sturm. Special thanks to Ellen Schein and Adam Bartley. This webinar will have a second life as a YouTube recording, which we will review with the panelists and post in a few days. And these videos really reach hundreds more. And as we move forward, this is just our entreaty in DSJ. Let's just remember our personal and collective responsibilities to foster ethical administration. Public administration's highest goal is to improve lives. And a huge portion of that is improving public service and serving the public interest. And an understanding of the law, both its negatives and its positives, are needed. So we need ethics at all levels: personal, group, organizational, systemic, and societal. So as we go forward with the rest of the week, just remember all of the wonderful comments from our panelists and just keep fighting the good fight. So thank you to everyone. Thank you to our panelists. And we will hopefully see you in another webinar soon.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Okay, bye-bye. Thank you.